Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and the topic for today's webinar is front of meter versus behind the meter batteries, an economic comparison for Massachusetts. And we have an excellent panel of guest speakers with us today, but before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled, as is the chat function. If you'd like to submit questions and comments, you can do so via the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Automated captions are available. Speaker bios will be made available in the chat as they're being introduced. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a webinar recording and slides within 48 hours, and it will also be posted on CEG's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today, my colleague Todd Olinsky-Paul.
Hey, thanks very much, Zareen, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm going to do brief introductions and a little bit of a background on Clean Energy Group, and then we will get right into the presentations. And as a reminder, when you think of a question, go ahead and just type it in as you think of it, because I'll be looking at those as we go through the presentations and queuing them up so we can get to as many of them as we can possibly get to at the end. So Clean Energy Group, in case you're not familiar, is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Vermont. We work across the country with communities, states. We work with national labs, basically all kinds of policy, project, community work having to do with clean energy. Next slide, please. So this particular webinar is introducing a report that we've just published, came out in September, and this is the cover of it. And it is a report that we conducted for and with CVEC, and you'll get a little introduction to CVEC in a minute. But CVEC is Cape and Vineyard Electric Cooperative, located on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And it's a local electric cooperative. And we had been talking with them. They were interested in energy storage. And the question arose, what would make more sense? One large battery front of the meter or several smaller ones behind the meter. And so we'll get into all the details on that in a few minutes, but that was sort of the motivation for this report, which we did through a contract with American Microgrid Solutions, and Nate Mills from AMS will be here in a minute to explain how the analysis was done and what the results were. Next slide, please. And by the way, this report is, of course, available for download on our website. It's free, as all our reports are. You can go ahead to the next slide. It's okay. All of our products, reports, webinars, blogs, everything is free on our website. So let me do brief introductions of our speakers for today. And we are going to start with Maria Marasco, who is the Executive Director of Cape and Vineyard Electric Cooperative. And she'll give you a little background on that organization and sort of what their interest is in energy storage. And then we will hear from Nate Mills, Vice President of Operations at American Microgrid Solutions, who did the analysis and will explain and summarize what's in the report. And of course, if you'd like to, please pick it up and read and get more details. Again, I'm Todd Olinsky-Paul. I'm Senior Project Director with Clean Energy Group, and I will be on hand at the end for questions and discussion. I guess that's it for me, so I'll pass the microphone over to Maria, and don't forget to put your questions in as we go along. I'll see everybody soon.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. We are Cape and Vineyard Electric Cooperative. Next slide. And we are very grateful to be working with Todd and Clean Energy Group on this project. CVEC is comprised of 25 member towns and counties and multiple participants, governmental entities from the Cape and the Islands, as well as Southeastern Massachusetts. And we're very grateful for Nate and his expertise on pulling together this report with Todd. Next slide. So a little bit about CVEC. We are a Massachusetts electric cooperative, and that allows us to work on behalf of our member towns in different ways of developing and procuring renewable energy projects. CVEC was organized in 2007 on the forefront of the renewable energy industry. It started with 7 behind-the-meter projects, and then did something really quite remarkable, which is brings this project all full circle, is that it developed a number of projects, landfill projects, where there are multiple members who benefit from the production of the solar energy and the net metering credits. So CVEC, for its members, offers municipal procurement and project expertise, economies of scale, which really motivates developers to provide us with best pricing and gets our project going. CVEC shied away from these large scale projects in 2017 and 2018, and went back to behind the meter projects. And if you'll note that we only have a handful of projects that have batteries. Next slide. So these are the projects. CVEC only has or will have 4 projects in the next year. Actually, strike that. CVEC will have 6 projects that will have behind the meter and batteries: the Oak Bluffs Elementary School, Nauset Regional Middle School. I did omit the Yarmouth Senior Center, which should be going online shortly, the Chatham Recreation Center, which should be going online shortly, which will have batteries, and the West Tisbury Library and the Tisbury Senior Center, which are presently just beginning construction. Next slide. So just again, our projects from 2013 to 2015 were primarily large-scale solar, which benefited multiple members. We went to behind the meter, and then the repeating questions or priorities of our towns are bill savings, net zero, and then it gets to resilience and backup power. So currently CVEC's model has been primarily the behind the meter, and then we hit a snag where the cost of these projects with the batteries just didn't pencil out. So the timing of this was actually worked out well. Should CVEC consider alternative options, and again, to benefit the most number of members. Next slide. So when we do our project analysis, we conduct site visits and we prepare feasibility studies, including right-sizing batteries. And then again, because these batteries at individual locations were not penciling out, that meaning where towns wanted bill savings as a #1 priority, and the PPA price with the batteries exceeded what they could get from the Cape Light Compact, which offers them a municipal negotiated price. We asked the question, gee, what are CVEC's next alternatives going forward? Next slide. So we started to work with Todd, very grateful to answer that question, which is better. The individual behind the meter locations, which CVEC has proceeded with since 2017, and then, or is it a utility scale front of the meter project? With that, I turn it over back to Todd to say, once again, we're very grateful for having the opportunity to work with you. And we look forward to our next projects based upon this wonderful report. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks a lot, Maria. I hope it's helpful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you make of it and what you decide to do. We're going to go right on into Nate's presentation. Nate, you're up.
All right, great. Thanks, Todd and Maria, and thanks for everyone for being here. I definitely did not expect 243 people, but I hope we have something interesting to talk with you about. My goal here is not to give you a lot of numbers and tables and death by PowerPoint, so I've only got a few slides where we're going to center up on what this analysis was all about. So next slide to start. Just by way of introduction for American Microgrid Solutions, we're a nationwide hybrid power systems developer. So we do reports like this, we do analysis like this, but our day job, and 99% of our time, is building systems across the country. And like the slide says, we are a turnkey solutions provider, and for us that means from the very start to the very end. And that means at the very beginning, you may not even be able to define what sort of system you want or know what the world is that you live in, given your budget and your goals and the characteristics of your facility. And we will help figure that out. And then go all the way around this loop clockwise to the end where once the system is installed, we become the system operator. So we care a lot about this tie between the modeling and the optimization in the top right and the operate and maintain in the top left. Because when we do analyses like this one, we're not as interested in theoretical outcomes. We're interested in what could we actually do, because we actually do these things and we want to make sure that our models match what we report as performance in the end. So if you have more questions for what AMS does, I'm happy to answer those, but for now we're going to focus on this analysis, the goal of which, like Maria and Todd said, was to evaluate which is better, big battery or small battery, and how would you decide? And with that, we'll go to the next slide and first talk about the assumptions. One of the key points about this analysis is that we wanted to hold as many things constant as we could, because there's a lot that is different about small batteries versus big batteries. We'll talk about some of the qualitative things that are different, sort of subjectively, about the two types of projects in a few minutes. But when we're running the model and we want to give you economic results, we got to hold a bunch of things the same so that we are comparing apples to apples as much as possible. So for all the numbers you're about to see, 20-year window, discount rate of 6%, and they're all cash projects. Maria said that these are often under PPAs, and that's the way CVEC arranges things. But in order to keep everything stable and not introduce additional impacts of financing and how one project might be financed versus the other, we're looking at a cash basis. So it's as though the municipality was just buying these assets outright. Because the municipality is doing it, we assume that they're all prevailing wage and that they're all still eligible for the ITC. Since we drafted this report and did the analysis, lots of changes in the ITC. Most of you are probably familiar with what many of those are, but the numbers you see assume that the entire project is eligible for the ITC. And if it's in an energy community, that it also gets that adder. That nothing takes credit for the low income adder, even if it's in a community that is eligible for the low income adder, because that's awarded by lottery. So again, like, we want to present the cost basis and the outcomes based on what we know we can do and not what additional benefits we might get. The cost basis is the same, and I'll talk about how we did the CapEx in a little bit. O&M costs are included, inflation and escalation of costs, both on the utility rate side and on the O&M side are both included. Everything's lithium-ion batteries. We know that when you get into the very large sizes, alternative chemistries are possible and sometimes even the best option. But that is highly dependent on the application and the use case, right? So in this case, we're planning lithium-ion batteries for both. Performance degradation for the batteries, when we know they decline over time, that's included. So either they're overbuilt from the beginning or they include additional CapEx midstream so that we can add or replace components in the battery system. And because we want this to be realistic, we use what we know of Massachusetts market rates from other projects that we built in Massachusetts. And on the installation side, this may or may not be true for your facilities, but we're assuming that we don't need any big upgrades, right? No existing code non-compliances that need to be upgraded, no utility distribution side upgrades. That's all outside the scope of this analysis. All right. These assumptions are challengeable for sure, right? And I'm sure we'll see some of that in the Q&A. And Todd and Maria and I had many discussions about what should be in, what should be out, and what should be held constant. So we're happy to answer your questions about those. Changing the assumptions, of course, can change the outcomes. And so if you were to do this sort of thinking about your own facilities, a lot depends on what you want for each of these things. All right, so let's get on to the next slide. We'll talk about front of the meter batteries. So this picture is courtesy of our friends over at Light Shift Energy, and this is a project that they built in Groton, Massachusetts. And for our analysis, we're assuming a single municipally owned site. This was out of landfill. And front of the meter really means like there's no associated on-site load. There's always a meter somewhere, right? Even the utility gets its own power meter. So there is a meter and the system will be behind it, but a front of the meter system just means there is no utility customer that already has on-site load that they're working with. So that's what this battery looks like. There's also no solar associated with the front of the meter battery. When thinking about what is most valuable to the utility, adding a solar field and cannibalizing some of the CapEx that could go towards a battery actually is expected to make the economics worse for a front of the meter battery, because the solar would be an energy asset for the utility or the municipality. And if you're selling that energy to the utility, then you're probably selling it at the wholesale rate, and that's worth less than more battery would be, because you're getting more and more economies of scale as you put more and more CapEx in. So the front of the meter system has no solar associated with it. There are fewer revenue streams associated with a front of the meter system. In this analysis, we're assuming that the structure is that we have a tolling agreement with a utility. So the municipality owns the front of the meter battery, and utility has access to that battery and can dispatch it however they want to minimize their own costs, and they pay for access, essentially, access and control to the front of the meter battery. So the utility pays the owner per megawatt of availability. So it's kind of a performance-based lease is one way to think about it. And then you can get clean peak credits as well associated with front of the meter batteries. But in this analysis, we don't assume that we get clean peak credits because the owner of the system does not have control of the dispatch. And that means that whatever the utility decides to do will not necessarily overlap with clean peak credits. So while they are available, we did not include those in the financial outcomes for the front of the meter system. There is no resilience associated with these front of the meter batteries either, right? And this is one of the biggest differences between front of the meter and behind the meter. No resilience. That comes with an asterisk. If you are a municipal utility, you may own buildings like right next to wherever you're going to put the battery in, and you may be able to find a way to get both, right? Because if you're the utility, you are offsetting your own costs by owning this battery and can also support a building next door, right? That's not the position CVEC is in. We're working with Eversource, and so this assumes that there is no resilience associated with the front of the meter. The size is another important consideration. So how much room do you actually need to put one of these things in? So you can see the car in the picture. We're talking about 20 or 40 foot shipping containers and multiple of them. And that starts to eat up a lot of space. This is not something that goes in a backyard. You need to have a plot of land. You need to have room to put fencing around it. You need access for maintenance, et cetera. So these are not small items that sort of go out back. All right. And then, so total size, you can see there what we used for this analysis. So 2 megawatts and 12.5 megawatt hour battery. This is an example of it being overbuilt from a capacity standpoint at the beginning, because if we're getting paid by the utility for access to 2 megawatts for a 4-hour period, like that's what the tolling rate is based on, then as the battery degrades, you will have less and less capacity. You may not be able to get that full 4 hours. So you overbuild at the beginning so that you can extend the life of the system. It's a total cost about $4.5 million. Right? So that's front of the meter. Big batteries, no resilience, no solar, and now we get to talk about behind the meter batteries. Next slide. All right, so for behind the meter systems, these, we'll just start with size, right? These are much smaller, right? So they fit in a couple of parking spaces. The example we've got here is from one of our projects, and this arrangement can hold up to 440 kilowatt hours, which is larger than any of the individual sites that we analyzed for this analysis. So we're really talking about a couple of parking spaces. This is something that you can put on site with an existing building, and we do this all the time. For this analysis, we had 5 municipal sites, and we designed the solar and storage, both of which are serving on-site load for all of those sites. And these sites all have solar associated with them, because when you're working behind the meter, you're no longer thinking about the solar offset or generating wholesale cost on the utility side, or community solar cost on a distributed model. Now you're directly offsetting retail power. And both because retail power is much more expensive than wholesale power, and because of the way utility rates are escalating, that means that the solar is the major driver of economics in a microgrid for a behind-the-meter system. So you always have solar associated with it. And the more solar you have relative to the battery, the better the economics of the project typically look. These also have multiple revenue streams. We have a slide demonstrating that on the next one. We'll get to that in a sec, but there's a lot more ways that you can make money than just a tolling arrangement from these batteries. So I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And the total size here, we had almost 600 kW of solar, and the total amount of battery is an order of magnitude less on the capacity side. And that's one thing that is an enormous difference between the front of the meter and the behind the meter, is that with the same amount of money, you can get a very, very large battery because the market is so much more expensive when you're at the small end of commercial and industrial batteries. Total cost, again, $4.5 million. And the way we came up with these costs was first by modeling the behind the meter system to say, all right, how much CapEx is this? We just add all the systems up. And that's what I would call, quote unquote, normal. And then we said, well, okay, now we have a certain pile of money. How much battery can we get out of that? Right? And so we sort of backed into the size and therefore the tolling revenue from the front of the meter battery. So let's talk about revenue streams. What is available for behind the meter systems? Next slide. So this is a graphic of power consumption and the impact of the battery and solar at a certain facility that we worked with, and just showing like what happens, right? And I don't want to drag you through everything that's happening in the graph, but it is important to know that there are multiple things going on, right? We have time of use periods in the rate schedule that allow us to spend less on electricity we procure at what time of day versus another. We may want to prioritize self-consumption. We may want to shave off the demand peaks, right? These are all on-bill savings, and these are all things that are well within the capability of most energy management systems that come with the battery. So this is just sort of like native controls. This is relatively easy to implement. I would say peak shaving is probably the most difficult of those things to realize. And that is not where the savings end, right? Like you can also get bill savings or CapEx savings by avoiding export. Like in some places, you have to pay prevailing wage if you're going to export from the system. In some places, you would have to pay more on the utility side for distribution side upgrades if you're going to export from the system. And if you have a microgrid with appropriate controls, it can prevent that export, and therefore you don't have to pay those costs. Right? So that's just an additional level of controls that someone has got to think about when they're designing the system. Then you can participate in incentives. I think probably most people have heard of connected solutions and clean peak and smart, and you can participate in all of those things. However, to participate, you need to be able to receive the signal that an event is happening and do something about it. And that takes more controls than are typically built into the box for any given battery you might buy. And then market participation is even another thing. If your battery is large enough, maybe you want to just be a resource in the capacity market. Maybe you can get paid for that in some way. Or you can become part of a virtual power plant where, again, you're receiving signals from someone that you are going to be dispatched and you get paid for the number of kilowatt hours you put out into the world. So there's a lot of things you can do with the battery. That landscape is constantly evolving. And if you have the right level of controls, then you can participate in all of them and decide on any given day what is most useful for you to participate in. This is also the place that the recent sort of addition or emergence of AI as a thing that can help with live battery dispatch Like that's where this is headed. Like how do you trade off dispatching now versus later, and how much solar you expect to come in to make the most amount of money from this value stack? That's the game when we're in operations, when we're trying to squeeze the most money out of a microgrid for economic returns. All right. I think that's it for this slide. So now we get to the comparison, right? So that's what the two systems are. So now we're talking about, all right, what's different about these? And the qualitative differences between these are just as important as the quantitative differences. So obviously, no resilience if you're doing front of the meter. You do get resilience if you're doing behind the meter, right? So that may have direct impacts on the community during an emergency, especially if you have critical facilities. It's probably faster to implement behind the meter systems. It's probably just faster because you can get through permitting faster, you can get through interconnection faster. If you do a front of the meter system, you may have to do an environmental impact study. You may find that you're too close to a wetland, which is a whole additional nightmare. So there's a real difference in what your outlook is and what your tolerance is for how long the system takes to get into operation. You could have a microgrid in operation a year from now, or less, depending on the battery lead times. For a front of the meter system, it will be longer than that, right? And it may be multiple years, right? And there's a lot more unknowns because of the regulatory risk associated with it. The number of unknowns is likely a driving factor for many entities that are trying to decide, like, what do we want to do? Like, are we sure this is going to work? Do we want to take a chance for 6 or 8 months while we try and do the first steps to explore whether or not it will work? If you have a small battery, you don't really need to do that exploration. If you have a large front of the meter battery, you do. Operational complexity, also a thing, right? Although I would say you're probably going to have an operator that does that sort of operational management for you. It just might be more expensive if you've got a more expensive battery. That's all. And that's built into the modeling here. As far as sustainability, if you are interested in like demonstrating sustainability and sort of having it visible and making a statement, then you probably want solar on your building. And that is not present in a front of the meter battery. So if you want to have a showcase that makes it very obvious what you're doing, then behind the meter battery, it may be more appealing to you. It also is true that the direct benefits of having solar associated with a behind the meter battery are, I would say, sort of more tangible than if you have a front of the meter battery, which certainly has sustainability benefits because it helps with grid operations, right? The utility reducing its cost is easing strain on the grid, and that has follow-on effects that are real. They're just harder for you to quantify and claim. For as far as scalability goes, I think that behind the meter options are more modular, more flexible, easy if you want to add a little bit here and there. The front of the meter installation is probably more difficult to do, if only because you would have to redo some of that regulatory aspect in order to do it. And then also qualitatively, there are different things are key, right? And like what's most important. And when you have a behind the meter facility, it's really about like, okay, do we have space to put this in, right? And is the utility gonna allow it? And do we have the sort of electrical capacity, right? Is our service big enough to do the thing that we're thinking about doing? If you have a front of the meter battery, different set of risks, right? Mostly regulatory. You might have sort of a NIMBY attitude that prevents you from doing what you want to do. And that is a much bigger problem than, hey, we need to lose a parking space. So those are different types of risks, and it really depends on what the facility is willing to take on. All right, so let's get into the numbers. Next slide. All right, I don't want to read all these numbers to you, so I'm going to avoid that. I will just say that the capital cost is the same for all of them, and that was intentional. The ITC is not quite the same because the landfill does get the energy community bonus. Some of the individual sites do not. And that means the capital cost after the ITC is a little bit different for those two. The columns that we're looking at here, the first three are all behind the meter. And there was a question as we were doing the analysis of how long the incentive programs would last, specifically connected solutions and clean peak. Because the Connected Solutions program is reauthorized every 5 years. So there's a question of like, well, okay, like what if it doesn't happen, right? What if it doesn't get reauthorized for some reason? I think the consensus is that Connected Solutions will last forever, as will Clean Peak. So we included both ends of the spectrum. You only get it for 5 years, or you get it for 20 years, and then we put one in the middle. So the two columns I think we'll focus on are the two on the right. Let's assume that we get the 20-year incentives and compare that to the front of the meter battery. I would say if you look down at the NPV line, NPV is what we often use to say, like, what's the best measure of whether this is worth it, right? How much is this decision today worth it to you to do? And I'm calling NPV line out for two reasons. One is that we do care about the absolute value of doing either one of these projects. But if you are part of a municipality, it could be that your cost of capital is lower than 6%. And so if you had an NPV of 3%, these numbers would all be different and better. So it really depends a lot on like your financial outlook, like, how cheap is it for you to get money? What other investments are available to you? That sort of thing. So that's a little bit about the absolute values. Like these are not fixed. It depends on your assumptions that are applicable to you. The other thing that's relevant is the relative value between the two, right? If you're looking at this graphic, you would say between the third and fourth columns that doing a behind the meter system is worse by about $700,000. Right? That's what this number is telling you. Making the decision today to go with behind the meter would cost you $700,000. That's the relative difference between doing these two projects on a purely economic basis, at an NPV of 6%. So there is a difference, and this sort of leading you to what you would expect, right? And like in some ways, the answer to the basic question of this analysis is obvious. Is it better to do behind the meter or front of the meter? Well, economically, it's better to do front of the meter because of course it is. Because if it wasn't better, you would never do it, right? A front of the meter battery is purely an economic play. And so if it doesn't work out, then why would you bother even starting the project, right? So those are always going to end up positive if they go forward at all. So it's a little bit of a sampling problem, right? All of our examples always work because those are the only ones that worked. When you're behind the meter, what we frequently see is that the economics do not work out on their face. That's true even in Massachusetts, where you have very strong incentive. Connected Solutions is huge. Clean Peak is huge. So you have all these things going for you. But the punchline of doing that analysis over and over again, as we've done, is that it always dilutes the economics relative to solar alone. And that's because the battery has costs associated with it, especially when you're in the bottom of the CNI range and your per kilowatt hour costs are relatively high. You're paying for it. There's a premium here. You're paying for resilience, right? You get something that's not economic that has a cost. It's not different than thinking about buying a generator for economics. So we expect the returns on the economic side from behind the meter systems to be less than front of the meter systems for those reasons. One is you're buying something that's not reflected in the dollars, and the other is we only have good examples of front of the meter systems that are economic. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Let's go to the next slide and we'll show you these numbers in graphical form. And I'll just walk you around this slide real quick. So what we're looking at is total energy spending over 20 years. The orange dashed line is the baseline spending. If you didn't do anything, here's what we would expect. You can see a curve kind of bends up because we're predicting an escalation in utility prices. If you think that utility prices will escalate faster than we've assumed, then that orange line would bend up even more and all of these systems would look better relative to the do nothing scenario. If we look at the lines and where they start on the left, they all start at just over 4.5 million. And again, that was intentional, right? They're all starting at the same place. Then they take the ITC in year one. So the municipality gets a bunch of money back. And then the lines start to diverge because the top three lines are those three behind the meter scenarios. The very top one, the one that costs the most, is the 5-year. The blue one is the 20-year. So we're really looking at the blue one right now. The gray line that has the band around it is what we're expecting for the front of the meter system. And the line itself is just the analysis, right? It has the tolling rate that we predict. And those tolling rates are unknown until you actually engage with the utility and find out from them, who are the only ones that know, how much that system is worth at that particular location. So we put a band of plus or minus 20% on the tolling rate to show like this is a plausible range of outcomes. And what we see on here is that the best performing behind the meter system is about equivalent to the lowest tolling rate we might expect from a front of the meter system. So they just barely overlap. And like I said, that's expected, right? We would expect that the front of the meter system would be better economically because you get other benefits from behind the meter. But there are some real things driving the difference. Economies of scale is a huge one because the market for batteries that are in the 60 kilowatt hour range is like very chunky at the bottom of the market. And if you need a little bit more than 60, you're probably buying 120. So it's easy to overbuild when you are doing a behind the meter small facility, which some of these are. Let's see. Yes, and the other thing is that like these are specific sites. Your results will vary because your sites will be different. If your sites are twice the size of the ones that we analyzed here, then the economics for those are going to look better, right? And this overlap will be larger. Additionally, we first did this analysis, I can't remember what year that was, it's 2023 or 2024, but since then, some things have changed, right? Escalation in the utility rates has been higher than we predicted, which is fine by us, because again, we're trying to put forward realistic estimates. So all systems will look better relative to the do nothing scenario now compared to a year and a half ago. And smart is back, right? At the time we did this analysis, smart, because of the value of energy, was not worth very much. So renewable energy credits and the direct sale of them is included here. Smart is now worth more than that. So all the behind the meter systems are going to look slightly better too. So as time goes by and as your facilities are different than the ones we analyzed here, that overlap will be more or less than it is shown here, probably more. In any case, there is a premium to buying resilience with having a behind the meter system. And at these sites, the resilience premium is something like $13,000 per year per site. So that's how much you're paying to have backup power. All right, let's go on to the next one. Last slide. And then we're on to questions. And now this is just the summary, like how would you even decide, right? Like what type of entity are you? What do you care about and what are you trying to do? So on the left, you got the front of the meter. Like if you're good with negotiating with utilities, or you are a utility and you can deal with a long-term project that's going to take 3+ years to get built. And if you already have resilience handled some other way, like if you meet the characteristics on the left, you're probably leaning towards front of the meter, right? And you can take that money, the extra money that you make from front of the meter system, and you can buy resilience some other way, right? That is a possible path. However, if you are averse to dealing with very long timescale projects and direct negotiations with the utility, and you already have some rooftop solar and you want to make the most of it, and you really want on-bill savings, and that's a better model for the people that you're serving, then maybe you want behind the meter, right? And oh, by the way, you get resilience from that, right? So those are the big differences. And the decision point is partly on economics, right? And we presented those numbers, but it's partly on what do you care about, right? Yeah. For example, maybe you say, well, I don't have $4.5 million. I have $1 million and I can get another million next year. Maybe you want to phase these things in, right? So you could do one system now, and then you get the ITC back from it. So you do $1 million project, get $300,000 back in ITC, and then plow that into the next project. And you just build one project after another in that way and stagger them. You can do that with behind the meter, not with front of the meter. So your goals and your approach are just as important as the economic outcomes, as long as you have an understanding of how much extra you're paying to get that resilience. All right. And that is it. So Todd, I'll kick it back over to you and happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I hope that we can get to a lot of these. We have a lot of very good questions. Maria, you want to come back on as well? But Nate, turn your camera back on, because this is the questions. It's not just questions, it's also discussion. We'll see how many of these we can get to. I just wanted to clarify one thing, though, before we get into the listener questions, which is I just want to clarify that when we talk about behind the meter in this particular analysis, we're talking about commercial scale projects, not residential or like a small commercial, like a storefront. We're talking about a municipal or sort of medium to large commercial scale system. And there's a big difference because one of the takeaways from this study was that those are the most expensive to build right now for a bunch of reasons. But they need, correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, in any of this. They need specific design and engineering. So each of these behind the meter commercial scale projects has to get its own sort of engineering and design work done. And then the siting and permitting for each project. If you're talking about like a power wall in your garage, you're not dealing with any of that. You're getting an off-the-shelf system. It's going to get installed by an installer who does, 100 of them every week. They're going to just come and put it in. The utility isn't going to require any kind of special study. There's no permitting process that you have to go through. So, other than if you're doing, say, solar and net metering at the same time. So this is very different. This is not, I just want to make that distinction. We're not talking about those kind of residential or retail scale projects because those are also relatively inexpensive per unit, right?
Yeah, I
So
think
the large front of the meter utility scale is cheaper. The residential in your garage scale is cheaper. The more expensive is this kind of middle medium size kind of large commercial. So we're talking about like 20 to 250 kilowatts, something like in that range. That's the expensive system right now for all the reasons we've just discussed. And it doesn't mean it's not worth it because it gives you some specific benefits as well. But I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on that. So let's go to questions. So we have several questions about right sizing. How do you right size a battery? What right sizing criteria did you use? Who inputs into the sizing decision?
sure. So that that is a result, at least in our workflow, of a feasibility analysis, right? And the important thing to know is what you're trying to do with the battery and like what your goals are. So if you're trying to support the full building for 24 hours, that's a much different battery than like, hey, we want to keep the elevator on and maybe just the first floor, and we only need 4 hours because it's a childcare center and you just need to stay open until the end of the day, right? The the decision about what your operating mode will be, what's the application, that drives the battery capacity. The battery power rating is driven by whatever the peak demands are of the portion of the building that you're trying to support. So who decides that? The host gets to decide that. We'll tell you what the answer is based on your inputs. But if you don't like that answer, then you can change the inputs and get to a battery that serves what you're trying to do.
That's exactly it. For our CVEC members, we're talking about a library that also serves as the emergency shelter, where they say, well, we need the lights on in just this corridor, and we need the heat to get turned on. CVEC has and for a different application, we would talk about a totally different type of battery altogether, where it's an emergency shelter that also needs to feed people, right? So it's just more usage. So that's how exactly Nate, we ask our members to consider what do they want these the batteries to do to actually, in many cases, supplement the diesels that are already necessary and in place for many of these, as Todd points out, municipal mid-size buildings.
Yep. And that satisfies the resilience sizing aspect. There's also an economic sizing aspect because it may be that we get the resilience answer. And so, well, that would indicate a battery of size X. But actually, if you're already participating in this incentive program, you can get to the next tier and make more money and also capture some economies of scale if you double the battery size. And so here's what that looks like, right? As a higher CapEx, potentially better 20-year returns. But those are the kind of decisions we want to help our clients make, is to say, is it this or that? And like, which is more important to you?
Right. So there's five behind. So in this analysis, the five behind the meter projects were sized through that process you just described. And then those were all basically added up in terms of capital cost. And the front of the meter battery that we're comparing to was then sized based on that cost. Is that correct? We're holding cost constant. So we're getting the most battery we can in front of the meter for the same aggregated cost as the five behind the meter systems. So that's how these were sized. Um, okay. Somebody wants to know, how will this analysis change considering projects won't be eligible for the ITC? And could that potentially reverse the conclusion? I just want to say, as far as I know, the solar ITC is sunsetting. The storage ITC is remaining in place, as far as I know. When you did these, were you including the solar ITC in the five behind the meter projects that have solar?
Yes, both parts of the project are expected to get the ITC in this analysis.
Okay.
Uh, the idea that that would change was not even a thought in anybody's mind at that time.
Right. So obviously that's one of those variables that, as we said, the behind the meter batteries are very dependent on subsidies and incentives. And so if there is a tax incentive that goes away, then obviously that is going to have an impact, I would assume.
Yes, and I would say the impact on this analysis it would tend to make the results diverge. So behind the meter would look slightly worse because that does have solar, which is potentially not getting the ITC anymore. In front of the meter battery would likely stay the same because you would not do a front of the meter battery that does not get the ITC. So we'll just do one that's
Right.
FEOC compliant. That'll be the requirement for the project.
Right. Well, the front of the meter battery doesn't have solar anyway, so the
Exactly.
solar ITC going away doesn't affect it.
Exactly.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Did you do an analysis with third-party ownership where depreciation was included, plus all the operational expenses being tax-deductible expenses?
So not for this project because we did it all on a cash basis. In general, it is because direct pay is a thing and the municipality can get the direct pay payment. We have not seen any examples where financing is a better financial outcome for the site overall. It may be the preferred option so that the site doesn't have to put up the full amount of capex at the very beginning, right? And that's a reason to do it. But whenever you have to pay for the privilege of someone else buying it, even though they may get a different tax rate and then they can take the depreciation, it still doesn't overcome the fact that you're having to pay effectively interest on that financing.
Right, and CVEC does have the option of owning these systems ourselves. And because we are a Massachusetts electric cooperative, we can issue municipal bonds, which will lower our cost of financing. But we started with the basics, and this gives us a very core and foundation for us to actually explore other opportunities to, again, benefit our member towns and counties.
Great, thank you. Nate, you referred to direct pay. Can you elaborate a little? And my understanding is that that's relatively new, and it's a way that nonprofits and municipal battery owners can take tax incentives, even though they may not have a tax appetite. Is that essentially it?
That's, yep, you got it. Yeah,
Okay.
once upon a time, that was not the case, right? There was no
Right.
direct pay. And in order to take the ITC at all, you had to have a tax liability. And that was a time period where financed deals really did look better than trying to buy it yourself, because not only did the financier get depreciation and get the tax breaks from that, but they also got the ITC, which made it so it's like, oh, well, why not finance this? With direct pay coming in, nonprofits often, if they have the cash, they're better off if they just buy it.
Right. Somebody wants to know why you didn't look at front of the meter hybrids projects participating in SMART. I'm assuming that would indicate I don't know what they're asking there. Why didn't you look at front of the meter hybrids participating in SMART? 150 such systems have come online in Massachusetts since 2019. Did you consider the SMART? And SMART, by the way, is the solar incentive program in Massachusetts.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
did you consider that for the front of the meter projects?
So we did not. When
Okay.
we were doing this analysis, the value of energy in the rate schedules was such that SMART was not worth as much as selling RECs directly from the solar you were buying. That I'm pretty sure has changed, right? So for all the analyses we've done in the last 4 months or so since we've had a firm understanding of the SMART 3.0 rules, SMART is back in play. Right? So for any given project, doing the analysis and then getting on with the project in a timely way, right? Like within months, not years, that'll be really important to realizing what you modeled.
Okay. This is a question about the image you showed of the smaller batteries that looked like they're taking up 2 parking spots in your. It looked like the AMS parking. I'm assuming it's your parking lot. It said AMS staff or something on the
AMC, yeah, it's a
AMC.
clinic, yeah.
AMC. Oh, so it's not yours. Somebody
It is
else's.
not our parking lot. We
Okay.
don't have a parking lot. We're a fully remote company, so
Okay.
yeah.
So in any case, it's taking up a couple spaces in somebody's parking lot. So the question was, is there a standoff region outside the fencing required for safety, or was that the extent of the setback and
Yes. So setback requirements are going to be very dependent on what your AHJ requires, and that in turn depends on how closely they're following NFPA 855, which is the standard document for what to do with energy storage, sort of generally. The general requirements are 10 feet from the property line, 3 feet from the building, and that relies on having certain qualifications that all the batteries we work with have and almost everybody complies with now. So 10 feet property line, 3 feet building, 10 feet to what are called public like exposures, which is lot lines, public drive access type ways, that sort of thing. So if you just plan on 10 feet around the battery container itself, then you're very safe.
Okay, great. Somebody wants to know, and this is a little bit of a long question, so I'm just going to read it. Following up on the cost breakdown of each system, behind the meter versus front of meter, understanding there is a significant cost differential from the medium commercial battery and the large utility scale system, how much of the cost for the smaller system is attributed to the solar portion of the project? How would the economics look adding a battery to existing solar? So I guess what they're saying is, say you already had the solar, and so all of the capital all of your investment is going to battery alone. How does that then change the analysis?
So if you already have solar, you would not expect that adding a battery will be free. It may pay back on a long enough time scale, depending on how much of the incentives you qualify for and specifically what your rate schedule is, how much you can squeeze out of bill savings. But if you already have solar, that being the economic driver and that's your baseline, you're already saving most of the money you're going to save. Adding a battery is not going to add to that in most cases. We've had very few facilities where we put in a battery and it was an economic benefit on its face for the facility. It takes a very special type of facility with high demand charges and very predictable loads. That's not the norm.
And there are additional costs. It's a brand new interconnection, right? When you add a battery, it's a larger system and therefore you need a brand new interconnection, which is money and time connecting with Eversource.
Sure.
That's right. Yep. So the analysis would show, here's how much it will cost you to put in the battery. Over 20 years, you're going to get this, this close to where you would have been if you'd done nothing. Is that worth it for you, right? Is the additional resilience you get from putting the battery in worth it or not? The other thing I would say about the battery is that unlike solar, the battery can sort of future-proof you against other stuff that comes up. So the utility changes its rate schedules, right? The utility introduces a critical peak pricing days or something like that, where they charge you $1 a kilowatt hour during certain times. Or the reverse, is, they change the Connected Solutions program to make it even more impactful, because on the utility side, like, their constraints are going up and they don't want to build more distribution. So if you have the battery, you're in a position to take advantage of those things we don't know yet. So it's not a financial benefit, but it's a risk hedge, right? If you want to avoid your prices going up even more than the otherwise than you're expecting, then having a battery can help you offset that.
Okay. I've got a couple of people who I guess are in the business of developing battery projects and solar and storage projects, and they are asking for more information about the CapEx. What's included in the capital expenditures for the behind the meter projects? Some of the folks are saying they seem high. Um, I had somebody send me an email after the report came out and said, "Oh, I do these projects and I only cost me whatever it was, per kilowatt hour, and this seems really high." I'm assuming that it's not just, the capital cost of the physical system alone that goes into that. Can you give a little more information about what is included in those cost estimates?
Sure. So like you said, it's a roll-up of the 5 individual sites and what it would take to install a system at those particular sites, including prevailing wage, and including what, like, we know of the costs of the components themselves. And so we know what solar and racking and all this stuff costs, and we have good relationships with the battery OEMs that we work with, at least, to know what their costs actually are. And we have a pretty big database of projects we've actually done to compare those costs to, so what's the installation? So we sort of build it from parameters of projects that we've already done and proposals we've already received. However, if the person asking that question is an EPC and they think they can build it cheaper, definitely email me, because we don't build the systems ourselves, right? We hire EPCs that are local to do that work. So if you can do it cheaper, I'm all ears.
But they do include the solar, right? The solar and the storage are both part of that capital cost.
It
Okay,
does.
so it's not the BESS by itself
No,
because,
no.
okay, because that was one person had emailed me and said, "Oh, does this include the solar? Because this seems way too expensive for what you're getting per kilowatt hour for the battery."
Yes.
And, yeah, of course, it's going to seem that way if you're also paying for the solar. So,
It's the total system.
yeah.
If you're a developer, you can send me your email. So if we issue another RFP, we'll make sure to have you on our list.
What's your email?
office@cvecinc.org.
Office@cvec Inc. Inc.
inc.org.
.org. All right.
Yes, it's in the report, I believe.
All right. You heard it, folks. Yeah. Get your bids in.
There you go.
All right. Let's see. Maybe we have time for one more. What kilowatt hours were specified for the library and emergency shelter?
Well, hang on. That is in the report. Which table? All right, library. Oh, let's see, 246 kilowatt hours. And the shelter was not, that's not the name of one of the sites. Maria, do you remember which one?
No, but it's the library also serves.
Okay.
Yes. It
Okay.
may serve as an emergency shelter.
Same answer. So yeah, this one is 246.
Okay, great. Thank you. And in answer to the question, somebody asks whether these are actual costs or estimated costs. They must be estimated because these things aren't built. These are, we're trying to do this in order to decide what needs to be purchased and built and where and how, not using actual costs, post
Well,
construction. So
I would call it estimates based on actuals, because that's how we run our cost model.
okay. Well, we've gotten to the end of our hour. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There were a lot of good ones. We did the best we could. If you are interested, the report, of course, is on our website. You can download it for free. This webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar and the slides will also be posted up within a day or two, probably. So you can review this or send a link to whoever you think might appreciate it. Thank you so much to Maria and Nate for taking time and sharing your expertise. And I will pass the mic back over to Zareen for any final announcements.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Here's just a list of some of our upcoming webinars. If you'd like to register for any of these, you can do so at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And again, like Todd said, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a webinar recording in 24 to 48 hours. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.